For weeks, we had been watching her. Usually while sipping a latte from the cafe window across the street from the park. She wasn't the only little girl he'd scouted since arriving in town, but she had been the most reliable, the most vulnerable, and those were traits that he always looked for in his targets. He had done his homework, and there were other boxes she'd checked off too. Name, Maria Hernandez. Ethnic, generic, forgettable. Age, 7. Eyes, brown. Skin, brown. Hair color, black. She wouldn't garner nearly as much media attention as a little redhead named O'Malley, or blue-eyed pageant princess from the suburbs. Her parents were divorced, and from what he had managed to dig up, her father was pretty much absent from her life at this point, though he did live in the same city. Her mother worked till 8 and was barely making ends meet. From after school until dinner, she was the responsibility of her teenage sister, who, from what he could tell, seemed more preoccupied watching the screen of her phone during their bi-weekly visits to the park than her younger sibling. It had all been so easy. Perhaps others might have flubbed things up, those who were too eager, too lazy, too sloppy. But for someone as careful as him, it had been like taking candy from a baby. Maria's sister had met some friends at the park that day, but they had only emboldened him. The older kids had been too caught up in trivial teenage drama to notice him slip out of the coffee shop and walk up to the little girl playing by herself on the swing. It didn't take much to convince her to hold his hand. A kind smile, cheery voice, a little Spanglish. Hola, Maria. I'm Tony. I'm a friend of your mother's. She asked me to take you home for her. They were cruising down the highway in his car before her sister even noticed she was gone. How long did he have before she was reported missing? A few hours, he estimated. The sister would probably waste time searching every nook and cranny of that park first. Might even wait for her mom to come home from work before she told her about what happened. The father would buy him even more time. He'd be the first person the police would check with, and it might take days to track him down. Deadbeat dads can be pretty crafty when it comes to ducking the cops, especially when they go years not paying child support. The sun was beginning to set by the time they got to his RV. He had it packed in a private lot across the street from a convenience store and hair salon where he'd been paying for the space and cash under a false alias. The RV wasn't some rickety old tin can held up by duct tape and string. It was sleek and modern, in good condition, and capable of picking up and driving off at a moment's notice. It was the kind of camper well-to-do families rented for cross-country summer road trips. Only once had he been forced to hitch his car up to the RV and make a run for it. But even then, it was due to his cautious nature. A long time ago, in a city on the other side of the country, he had made the mistake of setting up shop in an area full of nosy Nellies. It had rubbed him the wrong way, and he'd forced himself to abandon the mission even though he'd been jonesing pretty badly. A disaster he'd been careful not to repeat. Nobody would ask questions here, though. Streetwalkers and riffraff that slithered through those streets at night had no interest in who you were or what you were doing in their neighborhood so long as you kept to your own. How long had it been since he'd gotten his fix? A meticulous deliberation may have been a necessary precaution, but damned if they didn't make it a pain in the ass to get what he needed. He didn't want to go to prison, though. That would be a death sentence for someone like him, and he knew if he gave in to his cravings too often, he would eventually slip up. It was best to suppress his urges and bounce around from town to town, leaving as small of a footprint as possible, even if it meant waiting years between girls. But his dry spells had been getting longer as of late. There were more ways to get noticed now than in the good old days, and the longer he waited, the harder it became for him to think straight. On the outside, he projected a cool, pleasant demeanor, but inside he burned with an almost insatiable yearning to act upon his urges. He had been closer than ever to give in to his impulses this time. If he had waited much longer, he might have lost control, and the flame of desire would have consumed him. Just a day ago, it had taken all his willpower not to snatch a young girl he saw in the parking lot of a Poppy's while her mother ran in to grab a cup of coffee. None of that mattered anymore, though. Maria was in his possession now. She was sitting on the couch inside his RV, and in just a few short moments his needs would be met, and he'd finally feel the release that he'd been building inside of him for so long. She was a pretty young thing. Finally, in the safety of his mobile sanctuary, he could appreciate her without worrying about catching stares from nearby adults, but he knew he couldn't let his eyes linger too long. He still had work to do. "Just a minute, Maria," he said. His tone felt apathetic and friendly. "I had to pick something up first. We'll go see your mommy in a little bit, but in the meantime, why don't you see what's on?" The television was hooked up to a satellite on the roof of the RV and had far more stations than needed. He turned it on and began flipping aimlessly through the channels while the little girl stared solemn and quiet at the TV, and he wondered if she was beginning to sense the danger she was in. A familiar face on the screen brought him a surprise. For a brief second, he had seen a ghost, one that he hadn't thought of since he was Maria's age. Had it been a trick of the light or something his anxious mind had conjured up to mess with his nerves? He flipped back a couple of channels and realized it had been neither of those things. The ghost had been real. An old TV show he had watched every day after school when he was a kid. It was called Billy Smiley's Cul-De-Sac, and now he was looking at the show's star, the one and only Billy Smiley, front and center on his television for the first time in almost 40 years. A wave of memories washed over him as he watched the bald man in a yellow cardigan and horn-rimmed glasses strum his guitar in front of an audience of a dozen furry purple puppets. The show had been the lone bright spot in his life when he was a child. His escape from the troubles he faced in school and at home. Good old Billy had been a band-aid back in the day, one he used to cover the wounds inflicted on him by a drug-addled mom and abusive father. Now Billy and the rest of his happy little cul-de-sac were back, and he couldn't have asked for anything better to help usher him through his time of need. "You ever see this show?" he asked Maria with a smile. The little girl shook her head. Of course she hadn't. It must have gone off the air in the early 80s and wasn't as popular as the other shows on the kids' program's block at the time. It was a surprise to find it on in syndication at all. He placed the remote down at the end table, bolted to the wall beside the couch. "Well, why don't you give it a watch? I'm gonna run and grab something out of the back real quick, and then we'll go see your mom." He slinked off to the closet in the back of the RV, where he kept his special toys. He could hear the voice of Billy and the puppets ringing out through the speakers as he dug through the toolbox he kept hidden in the closet's secret compartments. His fingers were shaking. He was beginning to sweat and knew his nerves were a mess, but he was almost home free, so long as the little girl didn't mess things up for him, and all he had to do was keep her comfortable for a little while longer. He shot a look over his shoulder to check if Maria was still sitting on the couch. She hadn't moved. He let out a deep exhale. She wasn't going anywhere. Billy and his gang of puppets had a hypnotic hold over the little girl, and he marveled at how kid shows, even old ones, could still capture a child's attention so completely. "Now remember, kids, even if an adult seems nice," said the gentle bald man on the TV, "you should never get in a car with them unless you know who they are." One of the puppets, with beady black eyes and a bulbous blue nose, jumped up and started waving its paw. Mr. Smiley, but what if Groupie is really, really hungry and the adult has candy?" "No, not even then," Billy said, with a wave of his finger. "Sometimes bad people pretend to be nice in order to get closer to you. If a stranger offers you candy and tells you to get in their car, find an adult that you know and trust, like a teacher or a neighbor or a policeman, like Officer Oinker, and tell them what happened." The puppets all nodded their heads in agreement. What are the odds? He chuckled to himself. Of all the episodes of Billy Smiley's Cul-De-Sac he could have tuned into, he had to happen across the one covering the topic of stranger danger. Was Maria picking anything up, or were Billy's lessons going in one ear and out the other? Didn't matter. It was too late for her anyway. The doors of the RV were locked, and he was the only one who could open them from the inside. He felt an electric charge run up his spine as his fingers brushed against what he had been looking for. A hammer. He wrapped his hand around the handle, slow and deliberately, and then made his way back towards the little girl on the couch. On the television, Billy Smiley was still lecturing the puppets about the dangers of taking rides with people they didn't know. The time might come when a stranger does convince you to get in his car, continued the bald man in his friendly voice. And if that does happen, he might try to take you somewhere so far from your home, you won't know how to get back. Maria was sucked into the program. She didn't seem to notice him. That was for the best. He was squeezing the handle of the hammer so tight now that his veins were bulging from his forearm. The fire inside him has grown into a massive inferno, but soon he'd be able to extinguish it. With a swing of the hammer, he would douse the flames until they were nothing but a pile of smoldering embers. They'd rise up again eventually, like a phoenix reborn, but for a little while at least, he'd have some peace. The bald man on the TV narrowed his eyes and looked straight into the camera. Now if you find yourself frightened, listen carefully, Maria. His jaw went slack, and he almost dropped the hammer when he heard that. Maria? Had Billy Smiley just spoken directly to the little girl on his couch? The muscles in his neck tensed at the thought of it. No, it had to be the name of a puppet or something. Or maybe he hadn't heard anything at all. His nerves were getting the best of him, and his dry spell was causing him to lose it. And those flames were licking away at his brain, warping reality into some kind of bizarre fantasy land. Just swing the hammer. That's all he needed to do. Just swing the hammer, the fire will be gone, and everything will make sense again. He took a deep breath to collect himself. Shot a glance at the little girl. She wasn't reacting as if she hadn't heard anything odd. Maria was staring at the TV the same way all kids do when they're engrossed in their shows, so he turned his attention back to Billy. If you're ever with a stranger and want to go home, all you have to do is cover your eyes, just like this. Smiley cupped his hands over his face to demonstrate. Keep them peepers shut tight now, no peeking, and don't open them again no matter what you hear until you feel safe again. The puppets all covered their eyes with their furry little paws, just like Billy. What kind of advice was that? No wonder the show had been canceled. There's no way television executives would let a show stay on the air if it was giving kids terrible tips like that. Whatever channel he had turned into must not have screened the episodes before they bought the rights to the show. He glanced back to Maria and found her covering her eyes with her hands too. So she was scared. Knowing that alleviated his nerves a little. He didn't like losing control of a situation, and it was nice to be reminded that he was still the one in power. Oh my, Smiley said. He uncovered his eyes and stood up from his chair. The camera followed him as he stepped gingerly around the puppets and made his way over to a window. It looks like we have a visitor to the cul-de-sac. The camera cut to a shot of the window, and the sight on his TV caused his knees to buckle. He had seen the neighborhood on the show before as a kid, when every now and then Billy Smiley would greet different characters in the front yard of his home. It was always bright and sunny on the cul-de-sac. The cozy roundabout was always lined with nice little homes that had neat trim lawns, white picket fences, and pastel mailboxes. A slice of Americana he'd often fantasized about living in when he was young. But the children didn't tease him. His father didn't wake up on those nights that he'd downed too much Jameson. There was something different about the cul-de-sac this time, though. Something wrong, something terrible. And the sight of it made his stomach rise in his throat. Parked on the street outside Billy Smiley's home was a large RV. It was too modern for any 80s TV show. Even worse, it was an RV he recognized. How could he not? It was the very same one he was standing in. His eyes darted over to Maria, who was still covering hers with her hands, then back to the RV on the television that looked exactly like his. No, it didn't look like it. It was his. But how was it possible that he was looking at it on TV right now? Was it some kind of gag? Was he on some sort of new fucked up version of To Catch a Predator? He watched the TV host's long, bony finger tap the window. Let's go out and greet the visitor, shall we? It couldn't be a new show. He was positive that the man on his TV was no imposter. That was Billy Smiley. He was sure of it. But how could he look exactly the same after nearly 40 years? He rushed to the window, desperate to see the dim city streets, the streetwalkers, the drug dealers, anything that would allow him to regain his grip on reality. A homeless man, a stray dog, a deserted car, street light, an empty storefront, a trash fire, anything. But none of that was there when he cracked the shutters. Instead, he was met with sunrise, green grass, pastel mailboxes, and immaculate little homes with white picket fences. When he was a child, such a sight might have comforted him, but now only terror surged through his body. He didn't understand how or why he was there. There was no denying the fact that somehow he was parked on Billy Smiley's cul-de-sac. The door of one of the houses opened, and he couldn't believe his eyes as the man he used to watch on TV as a child strode out onto the front step and started down the walkway towards the RV. He slammed the shutters closed and then fumbled backwards, collapsing down onto the couch. The camera on the TV hadn't cut from the window's vantage point on the screen, and he could see Billy strolling towards him. Maria was still sitting quietly beside him, hands covering her face. "Did you know about this?" he asked her. No answer. Maria might as well have been a statue. But was she causing all this to happen? Maybe if I crack her skull open, it'll go away. Unless it isn't her doing this. Maybe it's the show, or a ghost, or something extra-dimensional that I don't understand. But all he had was a hammer, and none of the other possibilities could have been fixed with the swing of it, so he stood up from the couch and raised his arm over his head. He would aim for the temple, and if that didn't make the crazy end, then at least it might quell the flames that were, despite his new surroundings, still burning him up inside. If nothing else, he'd be able to think straight afterwards, maybe even figure out his next move. 3 knocks at the door of his RV froze him dead in his tracks. He turned towards the TV where he could see Billy waiting for him to answer. The thin, bald man was rocking back and forth on his heels with his hands in his pockets and whistling to himself. He stood petrified as he watched, hammer still poised above his head, afraid to even breathe, lest Smiley hear him. Maybe then Billy would give up and go away. Maybe he'd let him go about his business like nothing happened if he simply didn't respond. His prayers would not be answered, though, and a few seconds later a smooth, placid voice rose up from the other side of the door. "How's it going, neighbor? I'd like to welcome you to the cul-de-sac." He racked his brain trying to think of what to say in response. He was terrible at thinking on his feet. That's why he'd always been so thorough when it came to planning, but now, how was he supposed to plan for this? "Go away! I'm sick." He dropped his head and buried his face in his hands. Was that the best he can come up with? "Oh no," cooed the friendly voice. "Why don't you come outside? I'll call you a doctor. Wouldn't want you to suffer after all." Another idea came to him. He could always try doing to Smiley what he was planning on doing to Maria. Couldn't be that hard, right? Just swing the door open, bring the hammer down on his bald head before the guy knew what hit him. She opened his mouth to reply, but when he looked back at the TV, only a small shriek came out. The puppets had collected outside the RV and were bouncing up and down while pawing at the walls. He leaned closer to the television to get a better look. They were bigger than before, maybe twice the size, and they moved like a pack of vicious, feral animals. He crept over to the window and opened the shutters just enough to peek through. The faces had changed as well. Gone was anything that could have once been considered cute. The little beady eyes were now wild and ravenous. Their noses hung off their faces like bulbous blue tumors in their mouths. Who were those? One of the creatures leapt towards the window he was watching from and snapped at him like a piranha with what looked to be a mouthful of needles. Hundreds upon hundreds of them, each as long as his middle finger. He fell backward on his ass and glanced up to see things slamming their paws against the glass so hard that he was sure it would break. He thought his mind might break too, but before he had a chance to register the insanity that was staring at him straight in his face, Smiley called out again and the puppets sloped away. "Come outside if you're sick, neighbor. We wouldn't want you to pass that bug on anyone else in that lovely camper with you, would we? Of course, he knew about Maria. That had to be what this was about. Was Smiley aware of the other girls as well? Was this some sort of reckoning? But it wasn't his fault. He was burning up on the inside, and those girls helped him heal. It was the only way to stop hearing his mother screeching in his head, the only way he could forget about what his father did to him, the only way to feel in control. Did Smiley know about that too? Why didn't he care about him and his pain? Maria still hadn't moved, and in that moment, he had the sudden urge to smash her face with the hammer. If he was going to go out, at least he was going to get what he came for. But no. There were more pressing issues now. He had to figure out how to get away from the cul-de-sac. There was no way that he'd be able to make a run for it. Those things outside would chase him down the second he stepped outside. And who knew what they'd do to him? If only there was a way to outrun them. Of course! He was in an RV. Why not drive away? How had he not thought of that before? His head had been so jumbled, his insides so on fire, he hadn't even considered the simplest out. Hell, he could start the engine and make roadkill out of those furry things as he sped off. Billy, too, if he was standing in the way. He had only taken a step or two towards the driver's seat when he felt the back of the RV suddenly drop. His eyes shot back to the TV in time to see the puppet things bouncing up and down around his rear tires. The purple bastards had taken out both wheels. They bounced their way to the other side of the RV and began swarming around the front tires. A moment later, he heard two loud pops, and the front of the vehicle sunk as well. From outside the RV, he could hear Smiley speaking again. "Looks like you're having car trouble, neighbor. Come on outside. My pals can help you change your tires." The creatures began shrieking, and they sounded like birds being slaughtered. Was that laughter? Were they mocking him? The puppets, Smiley, and even Maria, who was still on the couch in her little see-no-evil monkey pose. Was this some sort of game they were all playing with him? "Please," he begged, "just go away." He sprinted to the door and pressed his face up against it. "I'm never coming out, you hear? Go away! Take those things you have with you and go!" The shrieking subsided. And for a moment there was only silence. He pressed his ear to the door, hoping against all hope that Smiley and the creatures would listen to his pleas and leave. And then that familiar, friendly voice spoke through the hush. "But if you don't come out, then we'll have to come in," Smiley said. Only this time his voice wasn't gentle or placid. It rumbled with such authority that he could feel it in his bones. A thunderous bang resonated from the other side of the door, and he jumped back. A second later, there was another one, followed by two more. "Did you really think the locks would keep us out?" The voice was so loud, he checked his ears to see if they were bleeding. Something smashed against the side window, and he could see it through the shutters. The glass had cracked. Another bang on the door, and this time it began to buckle. The whole RV was shaking around him. "We were just being polite, neighbor, because asking permission is the polite thing to do. But don't get it wrong. We weren't going to take no for an answer." The door buckled under another powerful blow, and two of the windows shattered, raining glass down on the floor. All that was keeping the creature out now was flimsy wood shutters, and they were about to give at any moment. "You've been a bad boy, haven't you?" said Billy. This time when he spoke, it was as if the entire world quaked. "You've been a bad boy, and when you're a bad boy, you need to be punished." More windows blew open. The glass littered the floor of the RV. The shutters crumbled to pieces and fell to the ground, and he could see the creature's gnarled features peering back at him. There was no barricade between them now. They began to scurry in one by one, crawling like spiders across the ceiling and walls. A final powerful bang on the door caused it to crunch and fall off the hinges. Standing in the entrance now was Billy Smiley. There was nothing friendly about his smile anymore. It was twisted like the branch of an old willow, and it deformed his face into something deviant and perverted. The puppet things were slinking closer. Most of them had filed inside by now, and he caught a glimpse of Maria out of the corner of his eye. That made a break for her. Maybe he could take her hostage and negotiate his way out of this mess. Maybe if he could reach her, he could get back some of the control that Billy and the other things had taken away from him. He sprung towards her, but the creatures were faster. Two of them caught up to him before he could even get to the sofa, wrestled him to the ground, and sunk their needle teeth into his leg. He screamed both in terror and agony as they began dragging him towards the door, where the strange bald man with a twisted smile was waiting. He swung at one with his hammer, but it smacked it away with its paw, then bit down on his arm. sinking its teeth so deep into it he could feel the muscles tearing. "Help!" he shouted. "Help, Maria! Help!" The young girl didn't respond, though. Instead, she continued to sit quietly and unmoving, her hands covering her eyes, just like Billy said. She wouldn't peek. Not even while he screamed her name. When the things began gnawing on his entrails, she wouldn't peek. Not when they started chewing the lips off his face and biting out his tongue. She wouldn't even peek when Billy doused what was left of his body in gasoline and burned it down to nothing but a pile of smoky ashes in the middle of the street. She wouldn't peek. Not even just a little. Hey there, kids. It's me, MrCreepyPasta. I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to tonight's story or watching tonight's video. And if you guys would like to see more or hear more, then I'd appreciate it if you click that subscribe button. Or if you're listening on the podcast, then click the follow button. We're moving into spring, which means that it's getting warmer some places. And also, that means that it's probably good for you guys to get a nice tall glass of iced tea. And if you've been here before, then you know that my wife sells things like tea. So yeah, check out Ivory Monocle Tea. It's etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocle tea. And as always, I want to give a big thank you to all you guys who support on Patreon, patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, especially Jacob Shaffer, Jay, Zach, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Lando Higuchi, Bobby Karman, Tristain Pelton, Chase Burnett, Diana Kraus, Katrina Beisel, Kayden the Spooky Boy, Zane Nightshade, MyBodySoundsLikeRiceKrispys, AshWood, Lord of the Weebs, Miss Xandra, MrUnsettlingSpaghetti, Eurogore, Tsuji Campbell, Marco Takes Dabs 420, Stricken, Azurine Fox, Robert White, Andreas Garza, Snails Brennan, Legit Quad Feed, Fried Chicken 12, James Bruce, Chris Levin, Freddy Krueger, Ty Nanny, Justin Johnson, 1-800-NIGHTMARE, Unknown Nobody, Michael Scarborough, Jason Wilson, Infernal One, James Lowe, Lisa Cottrell, Jimbo the Hutt, Caspian, Jordan Nels, Hades' Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Brian Arse, Cryptic Nightmares, Brennan Wright, Someone You Love, S-Man, Kiwi the Sloth, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Talon Karlik, Daniel Polson, Trace Miles, and Corey Kenshin. Thank you guys so much for supporting me, and if you guys would like to join them on the list of people's names I mispronounce, you can always do so at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, as well as all those fine people in the description down below who help support this channel and keep the lights on and give treats to Hylas and Hercules. You guys, as always, are the real MVPs, and I love and appreciate every single one of you who support there or just support anywhere by watching and subbing. So good night, everybody, and sweet dreams.